Hi guys, welcome to the archive. So one of the problems I've seen with new gamers buying miniatures in somewhere that is not focused around miniature painting and crafting like Games Workshop is that when they buy those miniatures, there's nobody around to teach them all the little tricks to get the best from them. Especially with the WizKids miniatures, which are branded as ready to paint. It's quite easy for a newcomer to be caught off guard and think that that's the best way to get the best results with that miniature. And while it's a quick way to get started, it isn't exactly true. There are quite a few little tricks that it is good to know about to get the best possible result from your miniature. Most importantly, a lot of these tricks need to be done before you start painting. On top of this, some of you might have picked up plastic kits or resin miniatures that need cleaning and gluing together before you can even think about painting them. To get started here, you're going to need a few little tools, most of which will last a lifetime. Depending on whether or not you need to glue your miniature, there are some of these that you may or may not need, like the glue. So from left to right here, we have the X-Acto knife or hobby knife, the Citadel mold line remover, a pair of hobby clippers, some polystyrene cement, otherwise known as plastic glue, and some super glue. Now, if you're new to the hobby, you might be worried about the idea of using a knife like this, but if you're careful, there is absolutely nothing to be worried about. However, if you do still feel nervous about the idea, you could start with something like this, which is the mold line remover. Now, this is not as flexible as a knife. You'll find it more difficult to get into the tight spaces, and in some cases you won't be able to get in at all. You also will find it slightly more difficult to remove larger chunks of resin or plastic or especially metal that you need to trim away. You can kind of get around this by trimming away with clippers first and then doing it with this. However, even then, it's just not as good as a knife. But if you are nervous about using a knife and you would like something perfectly safe, you can't possibly hurt yourself with, well, if you jab it really hard, you could hurt yourself with it. But yeah, if you want to have something that you can't cut yourself with, just pick up one of these instead. It's a good thing to get started with. Technically, you can also use files to shave down those mold lines, and while this is possible, I wouldn't advise it unless you're really uncomfortable with the knife, and the Citadel mold line tool is more expensive in your country. Files are fairly self-explanatory to use, but they're much less flexible than a knife for much the same reasons as the mold line remover. They're difficult to get into gaps, and difficult to shave mold lines without damaging the detail on the model. They're also a bit of a pain to use at certain angles. The reason I suggest the mold line remover instead is that it's a good way to get comfortable with the knife technique before picking up an actual knife. It's a good confidence builder. Finally, it's important to know the materials that you might be working with. Mostly this will be plastic, resin, or metal miniatures. Plastic miniatures are the easiest to deal with. They cut and trim very easily, they glue very easily, they are highly resilient to the edge of table drop of doom, and they're generally quite good for beginners. Resin minis can be a little harder, literally. There are two main types. You get springier resin, like this, and you also get brittle resin, like this. Either way, you'll need to use super glue to assemble them. When I say springy resin, I'm referring to minis by brands like WizKids or Reaper Bones. I've investigated this to try and see what they're actually made of, and while Reaper Bones appears to be made from some kind of polymer plastic, WizKids' composition still remains unclear. However, the material does seem similar, if a little better, to old Citadel Finecast, which was a resin blend, hence me calling it springy resin. It may actually be a similar polymer plastic to Bones, but either way it'll have the properties that I mentioned here. Springy resin is easy to cut and trim, almost as easy as plastic, though not quite. It has a bit of a rubbery texture to it. Brittle resin is a little harder, and you'll need to be careful when using a knife with it, as it can be quite resistant to the action you're trying to take. And if you aren't careful, or if you apply too much force, you can end up cutting deeply where you didn't intend to, either into the miniature or into yourself. So be careful. Also, if using clippers with resin, take care, because resin has a tendency to fire off chunks when you're clipping, like plastic shrapnel. Be especially careful if you have pets at a low level, as that could be quite nasty if it caught them in the eye, or anyone in the eye for that matter. If you do have a brittle resin miniature, when you scrape the resin to remove mould lines, which I'll get onto later, the particles that come off it are not the best for your health. You can probably get away with just avoiding breathing them in. However, if you are nervous about it, you can pick up a cheap dust mask that will keep it away from your face. For similar reasons, avoid blowing the particles away from the piece of the miniature you're working on. These are particles as well, not vapor or anything like that, so ventilation in the room doesn't really help. When you're working with resin from some companies, particularly the brittle resin types, you may have to clean some of the release agent from the miniature pieces. This will feel a bit like a sort of oily texture, where resin is usually dry and smooth. It's quite easy to remove, however, if you don't remove it and you try painting it, it will be like trying to paint onto an oily surface, and your paint will run like water down a window. Cleaning it off, on the other hand, is really easy, and all you need is a bowl of hot soapy water. You take the piece of the miniature that you want to clean, you put it in the bowl, and you rub it gently with an old toothbrush or just your fingertips. The heat does give you a good opportunity to correct any deformations in the model that have been there on arrival. If you've picked up your miniature and it's got a bent sword, for example, you might be thinking, well, how am I going to fix that without it snapping? I can't possibly. The miniature's broken, send it back. No, it's really not. They come like this quite often. And there's a really easy way to fix it. If you submerge the bent piece in hot water, bend it back to the way it should be, and then either just hold it and let it cool, or run it under a cool tap, it will keep the new position. And that fixes it. No need to return it, no need to go complaining, because it's quite normal for particularly the brittle resin minis. But it can be a thing with the WizKids miniatures as well, so it's a good trick to know. It also kind of works with the pre-painted WizKids minis if you've got some of them. Finally, we have metal minis, and pretty much everything that I said about resin holds true for metal. There are some slight differences. You probably won't have to deal with release agent, and any bent parts you can actually usually bend back, if they're thin enough, without having to heat them up first. However, what I said about the difficulty of cutting resin stands doubly, triply, 10 times true for metal. It is incredibly resilient, and trying to cut through it with even a knife is problematic. You may even need something like a modelling saw if you're trying to cut through a thick piece. There are two main techniques that you'll end up using to clean a mini. Firstly, you'll want to clip or cut any large chunks of material that clearly aren't meant to be there. With larger chunks, it can be a good idea to remove the bulk of it with clippers, though be careful not to clip too close to the mini. Clippers can sometimes remove more than you wanted them to. From there, you can use your knife or trimmer to remove whatever's left layer by layer until it's smooth with the rest of the mini. The most important thing while doing this is to retain control over the knife. It's usually a good idea to cut away from yourself, but control is just more important. If you feel like the cut is too tough and you couldn't stop the knife if it was to suddenly give way, stop and reassess that cut. It's safer than not and then accidentally cutting into yourself. The second technique you'll use a lot of is mould line removal. You'll spot these lines running across the mini, sometimes at different angles where the mini has been stuck together, especially if it's been pre-painted and pre-assembled like a WizKids mini. Once you've spotted them, removing them is as simple as holding your knife or trimmer to them at a 45-degree angle and scraping all of the excess material off until the result lines up more smoothly. You'll want to be careful not to hold the knife at an angle that's too horizontal to the mini, because this can lead to it skipping over the material and it'll cut little ladder grooves into your mini if you're not careful. On bumpier sections, this can be a little bit difficult to achieve. Don't worry, this is absolutely normal. On areas like this, you can either just trim away the easiest top bits, or you can get really obsessive and dive in with the knife to carefully trim away each little nook separately. I'd recommend the former until you're confident, and even then, I'd only go to such lengths if the Mini was intended for a detailed paint job and display. Finally, if you have plastic Minis, they'll come on sprues like this. If so, you'll need to clip them off carefully and trim the leftovers using the techniques that I just mentioned. Now on this sprue, most of the Minis are pretty much complete on the sprue. For a lot of plastic Minis, this won't be true, and you'll need to assemble them. Some kits have pieces that are designed to work together, so it can be a good idea to choose which parts you'll be using with which Mini in advance, and clip them out to check they all fit nicely together before gluing them. When you are clipping and gluing, there's a few techniques that it's useful to know too. If you have a delicate piece like a weapon or thin arm attached to the sprue at an awkward angle, it can sometimes be worthwhile clipping away the sprue connected to it before clipping that piece away from the sprue at its weak point. This helps make sure that the weak piece doesn't snap under the pressure of the clippers. When you're gluing, you'll have a bit of a different experience depending on whether you use plastic glue or super glue. Plastic glue is the easiest to use. I'd recommend getting needle nose glue like this rather than the stuff in tubes. This stuff is thinner, it's easier to apply, and it doesn't leave a thin trail of glue sticking to all sorts that you don't want it to. With plastic glue, you'll want to apply a small amount. Plastic glue actually works by melting the plastic to bond it, so adding more than you actually need ends up making the bond weaker. You'll want just enough so that the main points of connection will melt, but it won't seep out onto the rest of the Mini when you press it together. When using super glue, I'd still recommend a similar amount of glue. Overkill is a lot harder to fix than a poor connection. However, super glue can take longer to seal into a bond depending on the brand, especially if you're using metal Minis, which can be quite heavy. Don't be discouraged if it takes a while to bond, and try and keep your fingers away from the bond, as super glue, much like a zombie, loves human flesh and will seal near instantly on contact. You might also find after building your Mini that it has some cracks or gaps where the pieces haven't quite sealed together nicely. Don't worry about this, as it's easily fixed. There are two main products you would use to do this, and one quick technique that you can try first. The technique is fairly straightforward. If the gap is very small and the pieces are actually touching, they just aren't smoothly sealed, and the area is accessible, you can often seal the gap by using the knife scraping technique that I showed earlier in the video along the gap. Make sure you do this along the gap, not across the gap, or it might not work. If that trick just isn't going to work, you can try sealing the gap with either green stuff putty or liquid green stuff. Liquid green stuff is probably easiest for beginners, as it literally is just gunk that you paint over the gap. It might not seal it on its first coat, as it shrinks slightly when it dries, but a few coats are pretty quick to achieve. The more you water it down, the more coats that you might need for bigger gaps, but the smoother it'll go on and the less you'll need to scrape or wipe bits away to keep it smooth. I usually aim to use as much water as I feel that I'm going to need for the gap that I'm working on. From there, if you have overspill, you can just scrape it down like you would a mould line until it connects smoothly, which is one of the reasons I usually grab this stuff first. That, and I can't be bothered to mix the putty. You might also find liquid green stuff dries up in the pot over time. This is easily fixed with a bit of water and stirring it with a cocktail stick. Alternatively, especially outside the UK where liquid green stuff may be more expensive, you can use good old green stuff. Take an equal amount of each colour and mix it together until it goes green. Then push it into the gap and pull away any excess before smoothing it into the gap. I'd use a sculpting tool for this if you have one, but if not, a finger will do if you don't stop moving it. If you do stop, you'll probably leave a fingerprint. When smoothing, it can be a good idea to have a bowl of water nearby and dip your sculpting tool or finger in before smoothing.
This will help the tool slide over the green stuff rather than sticking. That bowl of water is also quite useful for mixing the green stuff and stopping it from getting stuck to your fingers. As you can no doubt tell, I am terrible at sculpting green stuff, which is why I usually use either the scraping technique or liquid green stuff if I absolutely have to. Finally, if you have a large miniature or a piece that you want to connect more firmly, you can use a technique called pinning. To do this, use a pin vise hand drill to drill a small hole into each side, up to 1/2 inch deep on each side where you can, though obviously stopping before drilling straight through. Try to make sure the angle of the hole will line up roughly. You can always bend the wire slightly to make it fit. Then take a piece of wire, paperclip wire works quite well, and clip it to a length that will fit inside both sides when attached. Don't worry if you can't accurately estimate this. You can place it inside one side and then push the piece into place and check how much space is left over. Then take the piece out and trim the pin to fit. Finally, glue the wire into one of the holes, and then glue the piece together as you usually would. Make sure both sides of the wire are glued into their respective holes. When finished, this gives you a much stronger bond. It's especially useful with pieces where they have two connections that don't quite fit even after any reshaping in hot water, like this hammer. I pinned this too, and it holds pretty solid now. I hope this video has been useful to you guys. If it has, maybe hit subscribe. Do you have your own thoughts on this? Have you got a technique that I didn't mention? Please mention it in the comments below. I'd love to learn new things, and if you've got a sneaky trick that I haven't got my hands on yet, I want it. That's all from me for now. Until next time, I'll be in the archive.